Good morning. This is Barry Jones, Standards Plus History Academy. And today we are going to finish up the facts of Watergate, at least as far as the public narrative is concerned. And then tomorrow we'll begin the backstory and start examining the relationship between Nixon and Larry O'Brien, chair of the DNC, and also, and most importantly, the relationship between Nixon and Howard Hughes. A lot there. I have pictured here the tape recorder that caused a lot of trouble for Richard Nixon. He is the one who installed the taping system in the Oval Office, White House. And I may have covered this before. It was ostensibly for two reasons. The first reason was he got tired of meeting with people in the Oval Office and having them go out to the press and misrepresent what they talked about. He wanted an accurate record of everything everybody said while meeting with him in the Oval Office, number one. Number two, probably for blackmail purposes. And then number two, he wanted for posterity, he was going to write a really fantastic book when he got out of the White House. He wanted an accurate record. So he was going to tape everything. Interesting. I had a comment the other day about Nixon being one of our least effective presidents. And boy, I just couldn't disagree with that more. Before Watergate derailed him, his presidency, he was extremely effective. In fact, I would argue, and I'm going to make the argument, he was too effective. And that's why Watergate happened. He was set up. He was doing things that were similar to what JFK was doing, just from a different angle. JFK, if he had lived, there would have been no Vietnam War. Fast forward to Nixon. Nixon was the one who ended the war. JFK was trying to negotiate a back channel with Khrushchev to make peace in a second term to end the Cold War. Fast forward, it was Nixon who traveled to Russia for the first time and ushered in an era of détente with the Soviets. In other words, a relaxation of tensions. The Cold War was coming to an end. It was JFK who initiated the first nuclear test ban treaty. Fast forward, and it was Nixon who began initiating the START treaties, which actually were the SALT treaties, and eventually ended up being the START treaties. Again, reduction, arms reductions, nuclear arms reductions between us and the Soviets. He was also the first to outreach to another communist country, China. He went to China very famously. In other words, you got two presidents have something in common. We were reaching out to our Cold War enemies and showing that there was a different way forward, and they had to be removed. So JFK was removed by bullet, and Nixon was removed by scandal. So I would argue he was very effective, and of course that doesn't even take into account all of the domestic achievements. You know, whether you agree with him or not, in the organizations that he created, he did. You know, as far as legislatively, he got a lot passed. He got the EPA started. He created the DEA, expanded Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. It's kind of ironic. He campaigned as a conservative. He governed sort of like a liberal. You think about it. He was very smart politically. When he ran for office, he knew how to get demographics to vote for him. He'd go down to the South and argue against busing, get the white Democrats to vote for him. And then he'd go up north to the big cities and argue for affirmative action, get the African Americans in the cities to vote for him. I mean, you'd think those are at cross purposes, but he was brilliant at doing that. So that's how the 72 election, you know, politically, as far as campaigning was concerned, he was a genius. And of course he had all this other stuff going on the side to help muddy up the waters for the Democrats. This bottom picture is he and his wife taking their Pat Nixon taking their last stroll from the White House to the helicopter to leave after he has made his resignation speech. You see Gerald Ford um, there to wish him good luck and bid him off. And I can't imagine. I don't obviously don't remember that. I was alive, but I was just a little boy. That must have been quite a moment in American history to witness your president leaving under such circumstances. All right. I need to review. The question for today is, what are the facts of Watergate that make up the public narrative? This is the same question we looked at yesterday. It's part two. We had gotten up to James McCord, his letter to Judge Sirica, and he had described for the judge all that was entailed in these dirty tricks and what the plumbers had been up to. So that's what we talked about yesterday. Today we're going to continue that narrative forward to the time of his resignation and show how that onion got peeled pretty quickly once it was public what these plumbers were up to. And you start to see people inside the White House now come forward. And the big bombshell, of course, was John Dean. John Dean was the White House counsel of President Nixon. So you just can't have a more damaging witness to Nixon than John Dean, because he was ever present at his side. So if there's anybody who knows what occurred, what was going on, it'd be John Dean. Now, I introduced something yesterday. It was an offhand comment about John Dean's wife. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but there's some hanky-panky there that clouds the credibility of John Dean a little bit because of what his wife and he were involved in on the side. No, having something to do with that call girl ring in the Watergate. So I'll just leave that there. I don't completely trust John Dean, but especially subsequent to witness some of the things he has said about future presidents, even current people that are running for president. John Dean has gotten less and less credible in my eyes as time has gone on. But nevertheless, this did happen. He did testify in open court, and he is the White House counsel, and so it caused shockwaves. There's one other point I want to clear up about yesterday. I kept talking about Nixon and his relationship with the CIA director, and we'll look that up real quick. Anyway, I kept using the name John McCone, and it wasn't John McCone who, just indulge me just a second. I always forget this guy's name. And okay, it's kind of important. His name is Richard Helms. Richard Helms is the guy that convinced Nixon to hire E. Howard Hunt. It was Richard Helms who Nixon trusted, and he shouldn't have trusted because Richard Helms was a sneaky fella. In fact, I think he's still to this day the only CIA director ever convicted for perjury. He lied under oath when he was testifying before Congress, and that eventually cost him his directorship, his CIA career. But it was Richard Helms who wiggled into Nixon's confidence, and he did so by appealing to Nixon's pride and his ego. If you ever listen to some of the tapes, you hear Helms talking to him. You hear witnesses talking about how Helms related to Nixon. He always deferred to him. He sort of played to his ego. Yes, Mr. President, that's a great idea, Mr. President. I don't know why no one else thought of that. And Nixon just fell for that kind of stuff. And so Helms was able to get inside and infiltrate the Nixon White House, the committee to reelect the president, and the Plumbers unit, all three. He was able to get his people inside. He did so by his relationship. He manipulated Nixon, and he uh, exploited that relationship to his own advantage. And of course, it just killed Nixon. But anyway, I wanted to correct that. It wasn't John McCone. John McCone was the guy who followed Allen Dulles. And then it was Richard Helms, who was the sneaky snake that infiltrated the White House, and operated that rat fucking operation of the whole White House, basically Nixon's entire world. Committee to reelect, Plumbers, White House. It was all infiltrated. All right, back to John Dean. So John Dean comes forward and testifies in front of Congress that Nixon, who's the president, John Mitchell, who is the committee to reelect the president chairman, but he's also the attorney general, former attorney general, and himself in the White House had discussed how to cover up Watergate many times, many times. Now, why this testimony seemed so credible was because he implicated himself. You know, normally when somebody comes forward like this, they're trying to cut a deal and they're trying to make themselves look at least less incriminating in the whole thing. But he included himself in this. He said, "Yeah, I was there. I was part of it." So a lot of people said, "Well, why would he lie? He's incriminating himself." So now you have testimony that's inside. This is not one of the burglars. This isn't James McCord writing a letter to the judge. This is White House counsel. He has more to lose in this, actually. So they began deposing, bringing forth witnesses from inside the White House. And one of them they brought in, I don't think they really expected to get much out of Alexander Butterfield, but he's just a staffer. And they're grilling him, giving the third degree, asking him all these questions. And he just happens to, I don't know the answer myself, but why don't you just listen to the tapes? And everybody stops and they look at him. What do you mean? Well, listen to what tapes? He says, well, Nixon tapes everything, all the content. It's a voice activated taping system in the Oval Office. If you're asking about what he said or what they said or what was discussed, why don't you just go listen to the tapes? So then everybody's like, oh, we didn't know there were tapes. And Butterfield's like, well, yeah. And he tells the story. He says when Nixon became president, he had it installed and he told him why. And he said, I've been there when the tapes were changed. I thought everybody knew. No, we didn't know. So the Senate Watergate Committee subpoenas the tapes, obviously. And Nixon refuses on the grounds of executive privilege, saying I should have privilege. And, and I kind of agree with the concept, principle that what the president says in the Oval Office should be privileged. And not necessarily because of what he's saying that so necessarily needs to be confidential. But, how many times does the president host a world leader from some other country or somebody high up in American industry or somebody who's prominent here at home? You would hope that would be a place where you could converse, do so without fear of recrimination. You could just be open and honest and have an honest dialogue without worrying about people listening to it later. World leaders aren't going to want to come talk to the president if they think everything I say can be used against me or can be out there in the public domain. I can completely understand the sanctity of the Oval Office, what's said in there. That makes sense to me. And that's what Nixon is claiming. So somehow somebody, and of course we know it's going to be the Supreme Court, it's going to have to figure out how to split hairs here and determine, okay, what needs to be privileged and what, if you're in there plotting a crime, that doesn't need to be privileged, or covering up a crime. It's kind of like with the attorney-client privilege. Attorneys, if they do have a privilege with their clients, but if they have knowledge of a crime that is going to be committed by their client, they are obligated to report that to prevent that from happening. I don't know all the whys and wherefores of how that works, but I do know there are some limits. And so the Supreme Court's going to be put in a position. What Nixon is claiming is basically there's no limits. Whatever we say in here, whatever we do in here, it's privilege. The Supreme Court's going to have to determine if there's limits. Kind of ironic. We're in that same position now. Former President Trump has appealed to the Supreme Court about immunity over actions taken while he's president. And the Supreme Court is hearing that case as we speak. So that's going to be another dispensation of law. Basically, it's going to be a new chapter in the privilege book, so to speak, that really has a big impact on future president, has a big impact on the current president. If you really want to be honest about it, if the court comes back and rules against Trump, that means the current president doesn't have any immunity either. So, you know, I really feel like we're handicapping future leaders if we're taking away their willingness to act assertively or to do something that might be a little controversial, or do something, these decisions. Sometimes you got to make the hard decisions. If you feel like this could be held against you later, you might be, what's that old term? You might be frozen in place. I can't remember the term. Anyway, paralysis by analysis. You might overanalyze what you're doing, fear that it might incriminate you later. It might be held against you later when the moment has passed. So anyway, I just say that to say history repeats. We're back in that same place again. But that's what Nixon claims, executive privilege. And this is where me and my class always take a left turn. And so I decided to include this because my students are old enough to start putting two and two together at this point and say, well, why doesn't Nixon just go destroy all the tapes? If he's afraid of what's on them, just destroy them. And inevitably, the topic of Hillary Clinton comes up when she was Secretary of State and had all those emails and used a private server, which was illegal. And so those emails were under subpoena, 33,000 emails. And she admitted to this, twice had her aides dispose of their mobile devices, told her to break them in half or destroy them with a hammer, according to an FBI report in 2016. This is a famous report that came out as a result of Jim Comey, and his decision not to prosecute her because, he didn't want to impact an election. Here we are again. How many prosecutions is Trump facing in the year of an election? And this was the same argument used not to prosecute Clinton in 2016. It would impact the election. And she herself had her aides bleach bit her server. So in other words, she destroyed all the evidence. So the question is, what happened to her? Well, the students know nothing happened to her. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And in fact, she makes fun of it. The other day I saw a tweet and it said, but my emails. It's a Hillary Clinton tweet. And she keeps going back to that, making a big deal. Like she's being sarcastic or she's tweaking people with this. You made a big deal out of nothing. It was stupid, and I got away with it. She's kind of like thumbing her nose at us. Nothing happened to her. So the question is always, why didn't Nixon destroy the tapes? The tapes are going to destroy him. Why did he just destroy? The worst they can do is charge him with destruction of evidence. They probably wouldn't have. If you're looking at the Hillary Clinton example, she wasn't even president. They probably wouldn't have charged him with that. He could have come up with some cockamamie story about, somebody threw out the wrong batch of tapes or whatever. And here's a bunch of tapes, but they're empty. they're I don't know. You could take them to put them in the limo of the trunk of your limo and go to Camp David and have a big bonfire, roast marshmallows. I don't know why he didn't destroy the tapes. That's still a question. Maybe he was just convinced the Supreme Court would never turn them over. I mean, that's my best guess. I feel like he thought the Supreme Court would grant him his claim of executive privilege, because up till then, executive privilege has always been upheld. So I think he was counting on past precedent. But he's taking quite a chance, isn't he? Taking quite a chance. And ironically, if you know Hillary Clinton's background, she was part of the impeachment proceedings against Nixon. She was a low-level lawyer involved in those hearings. She eventually got fired from that. That's an interesting story, but she was involved for a period of time, enough to know, and she came of age during that period professionally. And so I'm sure that clicked in her head when it came her time in the hot seat. She said, I'm not doing what Nixon did. I'm getting rid of the evidence. And she did. So again, history repeats. All right. So what happens next? Well, that brings us to November of 73. And through the unwinding of all this testimony and others coming forward, I'm kind of skipping some steps here, but uh, by November of 73, we're getting close to the end because 69 of his officials have been indicted by this point. As the investigation has worked its way upward and upward and closer to the target, which is Nixon, his more people inside the White House, more people inside the committee to reelect the president, uh, more people in Nixon's inner circle are taking the fall for Nixon. 48 of the 69 who were indicted end up convicted. A lot of jail terms thrown in there, sentences. And so in November of 73 is when Nixon gives that famous I am not a crook speech, which of course, even my students who are juniors in high school see right through that and accurately say, well, when someone says I'm not a crook, that usually means they are a crook. And fortunately, the American people didn't buy it. You know, he had cases before where he got himself in hot water, and he'd always been able to save himself with a speech. And oftentimes he appealed to Americans' natural, you know, we kind of have a forgiving sense about us where if someone comes clean or seemingly is transparent, we kind of want to give them a second chance. And he had done that once to save his vice presidential campaign. And they accused him of taking money, illegal campaign contributions, and using it for personal benefits. He brought that Cocker Spaniel puppy, gave the speech, talked about Checkers, that little puppy that he kept. And he said, well, you know, if you want to accuse me of taking an improper benefit, I guess technically you're correct. We did accept this little dog, but my daughters have decided, my wife has decided, we're not giving the dog back. And the American people just melted. It's called the Checker speech. But he'd done it several times. And so he thought, well, I can save myself with a good speech here. And he finishes his speech with, I am not a crook. Famously, it reminds me of Herbert Hoover chastising the American people during the Great Depression. Of course, we didn't call it the Great Depression then. We didn't know what it was. We're in the middle. We're in real time. We just know it's bad times. And Hoover says, it's like we're in a Great Depression. And the American people are listening to him give this speech, and they're like, aha, that's what it is. It's a Great Depression. And from then on, it became known as the Great Depression. And that phrase got hung around Herbert Hoover's neck like a necklace, like a noose, actually. And so the I am not a crook speech is like Herbert Hoover Great Depression speech, or the Jimmy Carter malaise speech. Yeah, you can use some unfortunate language when you're president. It just shows how people glom on to something that you say. And you think you're accomplishing something, and in the end, you find out all you did was help hang yourself. According to opinion polls after the speech, only 20% of Americans believed him. So you're talking about he's 1 year removed from the biggest electoral landslide in American political history, and now only 20% of Americans believe him. So you know that's been a long, hard fall for Nixon. Well, it's not been a long, hard fall; it's been a short, hard fall because it's happened in a year. So at this point, in keeping with the constitutional provisions of how impeachment works, the House Judiciary takes it up. The Senate's been holding their hearings, but the Senate doesn't initiate impeachment. The Senate is where the trial is held. The House has to do it. So the House Judiciary Committee begins the impeachment hearings. They subpoena the tapes. So this is the second congressional body now to subpoena the tapes. And of course, Nixon claims executive privilege again. So it's set up for a showdown. And this is what people refer to as the constitutional crisis. We've never been in this place before as a nation. How far is Congress going to go in investigating the president? How far are they going to push this? And we don't really have past precedent for this. Are they willing to take him to court, i.e., the Supreme Court, and force him to give up these tapes? You know, that's ultimately when you think about how our founders set up our government. It's a check and balance system, and you kind of hope that people will check themselves and use honor as their guide. But in this case, Nixon's playing hardball. And so will Congress respond in kind? We don't know. Furthermore, if they do push it, will the Supreme Court exercise its check and balance and actually go against precedent and force him to give up these tapes? In other words, deny the claim of executive privilege. So the question is, will the other two branches check the executive branch? Those are the big questions. Then, if they do, let's just say that scenario plays out and he's impeached and the Supreme Court denies his claim to executive privilege and they get to listen to the tapes and at least the Supreme Court says they're going to get the opportunity to listen to the tapes. What will the president do? Could he not just surround the White House with the military? He is the commander in chief, and say, "You want the tapes? Come and get them." I mean, I don't know. Nobody knows. You just don't know. This is unprecedented. We are in a constitutional crisis. We don't know if the executive branch is going to be checked. We don't know if it is checked, if the president will go along, or will he just hibernate, lock himself inside that White House, surround it with the military, and command the military to protect him. And then we're at a standoff, aren't we? So we got a lot of questions. This is unprecedented territory for us as a country. Right smack in the middle of all that, as if Nixon needs any more problems or America needs any more problems. Turns out there's been an ongoing investigation of his vice president, Spiro Agnew. And Spiro Agnew, this was part of the plot, by the way, and I'll make this case later, but turns out Spiro Agnew made it easy for the Justice Department. He'd been involved when he was governor of Maryland in some illegal financial shenanigans involving bribes and kickbacks and things of that nature. And they had him dead to rights, and they made a deal with him. The Justice Department made a deal with him, which was, if you'll resign, now this doesn't have anything to do with Watergate necessarily, but if you'll resign, we'll make the charges disappear, at least the bulk of them, pay a small fine, you stay out of jail. I'm going to make the case that this was part of the plot. It doesn't make Spiro Agnew was a hard case. He was a pit bull. He did a lot of the dirty work for Nixon as far as his interaction with the press, giving speeches around the country. Boy, he was a dogged defender of Nixon. And if there was anybody that the press hated worse than Nixon, it was Spiro Agnew. The liberal establishment hated Spiro Agnew too. You don't want to set all this up to get rid of Nixon just to have him be replaced by Spiro Agnew. That accomplishes nothing. So you have to take out the vice president first and put your guy in, okay? So that when the time comes that Nixon is forced to resign, people are, the intelligence community, people like Helms, they're gaming this out in advance, and they know where this is headed. At least they think they do. So if you're going to get rid of Nixon, which is their goal, you better get rid of Agnew first, and then you have your guy that you've already convinced Nixon to take E. Howard Hunt and James McCord, and all these guys, and they've wormed their way inside your White House, inside the committee to reelect the president, inside the plumbers unit. What's one more guy? If you can exploit that relationship one more time and get him to take your pick for the new vice president, then you can get rid of Nixon. And then the guy that you want to be president slides up one more seat. And it's just like what happened with Kennedy. You got your guy now. Kennedy's out of the way, the threat. And now LBJ, the puppet, the guy that you control, is now in the White House. He's the president. This is just 63 all over again. And so Agnew takes the deal. He resigns as vice president, and Nixon accepts the recommendation of all the right people to pick Gerald Ford to be his vice. Now, we've already learned in 63 during the Warren Commission, Gerald Ford was the mole inside the Warren Commission, reported back everything that was done, everything that was said, everything that was being investigated, everything that was looked at, everything that was going on. He's reporting it back to J. Edgar Hoover. And since the Warren report has been issued from that time, we're now in 73, end of 73, going into 74. He's been the most vocal supporter of the Warren report. He's been on TV constantly supporting the Warren report. Of course, remember, he's the guy that moved the bullet wound, the back of the president's, by the shoulder blades. That back wound, he moved it up 6 inches to the back of his neck to make the single bullet theory work. This guy has skin in the game to protect the Warren report. And if there's anybody, and he's already covered up once, right? He's a trustworthy cover-up artist. And so he is being maneuvered into place to do it again. The powers that be know that this guy could be relied upon to cover up. He's already done it once. He's been doing it since 63. What's one more cover up? And when we get done with these this Watergate, and you start to see the connective tissue between the Watergate and JFK assassination, you understand why he was chosen. Because it's not two cover-ups. It's actually one ongoing long cover-up. And Watergate, Nixon's past, and all the things that are going to be involved in Watergate, including E. Howard Hunt, all those characters, has to be covered up, has to be terminated. This has to be tied off. So you need somebody, just like you needed somebody to pick the Warren Commission in 63, and LBJ is your man. You need somebody now to tie off Watergate, to prevent trials in the future that might go back and expose, yes, Watergate, but also the JFK assassination. So Gerald Ford is the pick. And Nixon, that's the one flaw I see in Nixon that, I can almost draw a parallel to him and Trump. If you think about some of the people Trump picked for his presidency that undid him, they ended up being unwise selections. And it's because he came into Washington. He really didn't know the lay of the land. He wasn't a career politician, and he got some advice. He got some bad advice. He listened to some wrong people. Maybe this next time, if he wins, he won't. I don't know. But the first time he did. And here we are in this situation. Nixon's listening to some people that don't have his best interests at heart. And one of them, but probably the most prominent one, is Richard Helms, the director of the CIA. He is leading Nixon around by the nose. And there's some other high up in the Republican Party, and Alexander Haig is in the White House. He's conflicted. He's not true blue. He's not loyal. So Nixon is surrounded by some, it's kind of like a Judas Iscariots. You think the closer you keep these people to your inner circle, they'd be more loyal, more trustworthy, but they're not. They're not. So anyway, that's the transition that takes place there. So now it's all set up. And now the Supreme Court comes in with the hammer. July 24th, 1974. Now things are going to move quickly because, there's been some dialogue back and forth, where some negotiations where Nixon says, well, I'll give you transcripts of the tapes, but not the actual tapes. And the House says, no, 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 we want the actual tapes. And so the Supreme Court ends up having to settle this matter. And on July 24th, 1974, as a result of the court case U.S. versus Nixon, the Supreme Court orders Nixon to turn over the tapes. So we have our answer now to the first question. Will Congress check the executive branch by pushing this in the courts? The answer is yes. And the answer to the second question is, will the Supreme Court check the executive branch by forcing Nixon to turn over the tapes? And the answer is yes. So now we're down to the third question in this constitutional crisis. What's Nixon going to do? Well, I just noticed I misspelled missing. Sorry about that. Anyway, he turns over the tapes. Now, in his defense, Nixon turns over the tapes. So as far as honor is concerned, Nixon at least met that standard. Now, it wasn't complete. Some of the tapes were missing, and they're all chronologically dated, so you know which ones were missing. One had an 18.5-minute gap, which came at a pivotal moment. As you're listening to the tape, they were just getting into the conversation about Watergate, and he's explaining to, Nixon's talking, he's talking to his aides, and he's beginning to tell them a story. And then it just cuts out. And for 18.5 minutes, it's gone. And then it picks up again after the conversation ends. And of course, the House Judiciary Committee really wants to know what happened in that 18.5-minute gap, because it appeared where that conversation was headed, it's going to answer all their questions. And this is gone. And of course, the White House says, oh, it must have been some sinister force. They actually blame their secretary, Rosemary Woods. They said, well, when she bent back to hit the switch on the tape or on the phone, she actually hit the switch on the tape, and she dubbed over it. And they call it the Rosemary stretch, famously. But anyway, I am going to tell you, we're going to cover what is in that 18.5-minute gaps, because there was a witness who told his lawyer what was on that 18.5-minute gap. So anyway, we'll talk about that. But at that moment in real time, the House Judiciary Committee doesn't know what's on that 18.5-minute gap. But there's enough stuff on the rest of the tapes to show the president is vulgar, he's profane, he's racist. I mean, it really presented an ugly view of President Nixon, these tapes. Now, none of that's illegal. Okay. It just doesn't make him look very good. And it's kind of interesting. Nixon grew up with a domineering mother. And to the day, when he's president of the United States, he's the most powerful man in the free world, in the world, really. And he keeps commenting as he cusses and swears his way through conversations. Boy, I can never let my mom hear me talk like this. I can never hear my mom talk like this. He's always worried about his mother. Some of the things that came out as a result of these tapes were these dirty tricks that the plumbers had been involved in. I mean, some pretty heavy stuff. All right, some of it's just clever, like the Canuck letter. The Canuck letter was that famous letter. It was written on Ed Muskie stationery, and it used the word Canucks. And it was about the time of the New York primary. In upstate New York, there's a lot of French Canadians who live up there around Buffalo, and they don't like being called Canucks. It's a pejorative term. And it would be like calling an African-American person the N-word. It's kind of that way. And at least it can be interpreted that way. And it's a very disparaging letter about these French Canadians. And of course, it's on Ed Muskie stationery. When it gets released, right before the New York primary, it just kills Ed Muskie's campaign in upstate New York. He's trying to get these French Canadians to vote for him. And of course, the whole thing was concocted. It was contrived. And Ed Muskie tries desperately to save his campaign. He denies having any knowledge of this. He's as mystified as the next person how it got on his stationery. Well, it turns out the plumbers did this. And it ruined Ed Muskie's campaign, which was the point. Ed Muskie was a candidate Nixon didn't want to face in 72. So they sabotaged, rat fucked. They rat fucked his campaign. They infiltrated it, got his stationery. Somebody on the inside got his stationery, and they typed up a letter on it, and they leaked it, and boom, Ed Muskie has to withdraw. And that was, when we start talking about how Nixon won in 72 so convincingly, it was because he ended up running against McGovern, which was the guy they wanted to run against. They didn't want to run against Ed Muskie. They also didn't want to run against Tom Eagleton. They found out that Eagleton was seen as a psychiatrist. So they broke into the psychiatrist's office, much like they had Daniel Ellsberg's office. Remember, Daniel Ellsberg was the leaker of the Pentagon Papers. They'd broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist office as well. So they had experience with this. They did it with Eagleton, and they copied his file, and they leaked it. And it showed that Eagleton had been seen as a psychiatrist. He had a case of depression. He was on antidepressants. Well, nobody wants to vote for a presidential candidate, especially back in early 70s, who's seen a psychiatrist and might be dealing with depression issues, and he's on medication. That ruined Eagleton's campaign. He had to drop out. So you see what's happening. They're picking off the stronger candidates while they're leaving McGovern alone. McGovern never gets touched. They want to run against McGovern, which is what they ended up doing. Then we get into some serious crimes. Jack Anderson, we're going to start talking about Jack Anderson tomorrow. Jack Anderson become a real nemesis to Nixon. And they wanted him, whether the order came from Nixon or not, the Plumbers tried to kill him. It was attempted murder, and they missed. Jack Anderson survived, or it didn't go through, but the plan was to kill Jack Anderson. So you can see the Plumbers, and it's a little bit of a dismissive term, calling them the Plumbers doesn't imply the seriousness of these people. These are former CIA covert operators who they made their bones down in doing all these anti-Castro operations for the CIA, for the mafia. These guys are serious people. Hard telling how many people they've killed, right? These are serious operators here. This is not just dirty tricks and fun and games. They're going to try to murder somebody, and these are experienced operators. One of them, Frank Fiorini or Frank Sturgis, is a self-confessed CIA assassin. That's what he does. They did burglaries, they did money laundering, they had slush funds. We'll get into the slush fund a little bit tomorrow. Some really bad stuff. So they've clearly got enough here to begin impeachment proceedings against Nixon, but they just keep learning more. They find out who wrote the Canuck letter. I've got an arrow to his name is Ken Clausen. And Ken Clausen's in the White House, right? He's got an official position in the committee to reelect the president. And then who led all the rat fucking efforts we've been talking about? It was Donald Segretti. Donald Segretti, they did a good job of this in the All the President's Men, the movie. He was just this young guy, and they called him the SC Mafia. They all came from USC. They were Trojans from the University of Southern Cal. When they were students, they did all this to rig elections in student government, and it worked so well. You can see the guy looks like a kid. He looks like he's 12 years old. So he's the guy in the committee to reelect and in the White House operating the Plumbers' rat fucking efforts. And he's basically doing what he did in college, and he's just, he's transferring that to the White House, doing it on a bigger scale now. So the noose is tightening around Nixon. The smoking gun tape, they call it the smoking gun tape, is when Nixon is heard discussing personally the use of electronic surveillance against the Democrats, the use of wiretapping and bugging of these offices, the use of federal agencies to go after his enemies, most notably the IRS, auditing people that he gave them a list of names, and they'd start targeting these people. And then obviously the most damning conversation was the one he was having with Bob Haldeman and discussing with his aides about how to get the CIA to tell the FBI to back off, and the Watergate investigation. And we've already looked at that conversation. And so now they've got him, right? I mean, obstruction of justice in his own words. And so the impeachment proceedings begin. They charge him with abuse of power, obstruction of justice, contempt of Congress. The abuse of power is using agencies of the federal government to go after political enemies. That's an abuse. Obviously, obstruction of justice, telling the CIA to tell the FBI to back off, and contempt of Congress for 2 times refusing subpoenas for the tapes. And Nixon still thinks he's going to survive this because he feels like if the Republicans stick together, he can survive impeachment, because as we know, it's not just a simple majority to impeach a president. But he gets a visit. Republican senators come up to the White House and they inform Nixon. They're led by a senator from my state, Howard Baker. They inform Nixon that he'd better resign because they're going to vote to impeach. If the House presents them with impeachment and they have to have a trial, they're going to vote to convict him. And of course, I think at this moment, it's a come to Jesus moment where they're laying out the options and they're saying, okay, the evidence is too overwhelming, Mr. President. If we have to vote to convict and you're convicted, you understand what that means. You'll be thrown out of office and you'll lose your pension. And that will open you up to criminal prosecution as a private citizen. If you resign, and the other thing is if you don't resign, they're going to impeach you and we are going to convict you. That means a trial. And but if you resign, all that goes away. They won't impeach. We won't have a Senate trial, and so you'll keep your pension. And then of course they call it the corrupt bargain. The deal has already been struck. And this is part of the deal that Nixon made, that they offered Nixon in exchange for him accepting Ford as his VP selection after Spiro Agnew fell off. And that was to accept Ford, and Ford promises to give you a pardon if you need it, a full pardon. So they remind him of this. Let's game this out, Mr. President. If you don't resign, the House is going to impeach, at which point we're going to have a trial and we're going to vote to convict, at which point you're thrown out of office and you lose your pension, at which point you now become liable for criminal prosecution as a private citizen. None of that's good for you, Mr. President. And of course, what's left unsaid is none of that's good for some other people either. But that can all go away if you resign. If you resign, there will be no impeachment, which means you will not be one of the presidents in history that's been impeached, which means there'll be no Senate trial to convict you, which means you've left office of your own volition, which means you keep your pension. And then 30 days from now, Ford will step up and do what he promised you to do. He will pardon you, which means no criminal trial as a private citizen. Boy, it's been set up beautifully. And Nixon, who could take all of Washington down with him in one trial, much less 2 trials, is eased out the back door. And Ford gives that speech. Our long national nightmare is over. The Senate trial doesn't happen. The pardon forecloses on a criminal trial. By the way, the pardon happened 30 days to the day. I mean, somewhere it must have been written down. Within 30 days, Ford will pardon you because on the 30th day, he pardoned him. So that pardon forecloses on a criminal trial. And that's the most important outcome in all of this, is that there's no trial. And Ford has done his part. Essentially, what he's done is fallen on his sword. Okay, we now know that he loses his election in 76, primarily because the American people never forgive him for this pardon. So you look back at Ford's role in all of this history, and you realize he's kind of the patsy for the Intelligence Committee. He's the guy that moves the bullet wound down up 6 inches to make possible the single bullet theory. He's the guy that the Warren Commission trots out in front of the media to fall on his sword and argue ridiculous arguments to support the Warren report. Even as time goes on and the evidence stacks up against it, he's always the guy who has to go out and defend it. And he's the guy that's going to have to fall on his sword and pardon Nixon. And his reward for that is 2 years in the White House. But when he tries to win an election in his own right in 76, he loses because of that. And of course, history looks back on Ford much differently now because we know the part he played in all of this cover-up. It takes a guy like Ford, just like it took a guy like LBJ. And you gotta think the same thing happened to LBJ. He fell on his sword to protect the conspiracy in 63 by appointing the Warren Commission. And what was the exchange? For you being president, you got a green light the Vietnam War. Well, what eventually killed LBJ's presidency was the Vietnam War. That's why he chose not to run again when he could have run again. He chose not to in 68. The war just killed him. He became a prisoner in the White House. So both presidents who covered up, there was a temporary reprieve, there was a temporary reward, but in the end, they were buried by that corrupt bargain that they made in Ford's case and the deal with the devil that LBJ made in 63. They were both buried by it. So, and history doesn't look kind on people who sell their soul for 30 pieces of silver, which is what they both did. So anyway, that's the public narrative of Watergate. And that in and of itself is scandalous enough, right? But it gets better. Tomorrow, we're going to begin looking at what Nixon was obsessively worried about. His name was Larry O'Brien. He was the DNC chairperson. It was not because of Larry O'Brien himself. It was because of what Larry O'Brien knew about another relationship that Nixon had with somebody named Howard Hughes. And we'll get to that tomorrow. So hope you enjoyed today. Check out my website, sphistory.com or barryljones.com. Feel free to subscribe to my channel. It is free. And hit the thumbs up or the notification bell. And until next time, everybody have a great day. Thank you.